the blood diamond, I'll start with that. Well, Israel, if you just look at the overall Israeli exports, it might give you the impression that diamonds are Israel's by far biggest export. But if you actually look at the net export of diamonds, if you reduce from that the cost of importing raw diamonds, it is not the biggest export, but it is still quite significant. And of course, if any of you are planning on buying diamonds, please do make sure that these are not Israeli diamonds. But this is not the most effective way of putting pressure on Israel, because usually leftist activists don't tend to hoard lots of diamonds. But instead, what could be much more effective is to get Israel kicked out of the Kimberley process. Because the Kimberley process, to ensure that blood diamonds will not be traded, is in fact there in order to make sure that countries do not use profits from diamonds for illicit use. The problem is that the Kimberley process defines conflict diamonds only as diamonds who are mined in conflict areas and not diamonds who are refined in conflict areas. I think we would agree that Israel is a conflict area, Palestine is a conflict area, but since the mines are not actually, the diamonds are not from Palestine but are from Africa, the Kimberley process that allows Israel to be part, and in 2010, Israel was elected was selected to be the chair of the Kimberley process, as horrible as that sounds. But there is still much that can be done, and there are activists, especially in Ireland. Sean Clinton is a very good activist who would be very happy to get any kind of support that you can give in order to get Israel out of the Kimberley process. And Veolia is a very good example, and I really like talking about Veolia because it really is one of the best successes, and a lot of it owes also to UK municipalities that were able to get Veolia kicked out of local projects. Veolia does two things in Palestine. One of them is the illegal railway in East Jerusalem, and the second thing, which connects the illegal colonies into the city center in order to provide employment and trade opportunities to the colonists. And the second thing is the garbage disposal of colonies, by which they dump this garbage on Palestinian land in the West Bank. These things, of course, are unacceptable. And when Veolia thought that they're just going to make another little project in Palestine like they do in so many other places in the world, and didn't think much about the human rights aspect and the legal aspects of that, they got into a lot of trouble. And in fact, when they started to get questions asked by activists from around the world, they hired a lawyer to tell them how they should respond to the accusations that they are breaking the law. They read the report written by the lawyer, censored the report, fired the lawyer, and I guess we can assume that their legal defense is quite flimsy. They didn't like what they saw there. The biggest contract that they lost was a $5 billion contract, or $4.5 billion contract that they've lost in Stockholm. Stockholm decided not to award Veolia the contract to build a railway in Stockholm. And that project alone was about 5 times bigger than the size of the project in East Jerusalem. And Veolia has been trying very desperately to sell their stocks in East Jerusalem so they can distance themselves, but no international company was willing to buy it from them. No international company was willing to get this purely illegal project. And since then, Veolia made a lot of embarrassing mistakes, such as they did a poll in Jerusalem about the tramway and asked people, would you mind if there would be Arabs on the train with you? Of course, that didn't win them a lot of supporters either. And they also put up want ads for workers where they demand Hebrew as a first language and military service as a requirement to get a job in the company. Obviously, that disqualifies Palestinians, and that was also a cause for a lot of criticism. Eventually, the Israeli government had no choice but to allow Israeli companies to bid for the stocks that Veolia was trying to sell. Even though Israeli companies have absolutely no experience in building tramways, there are no tramways in Israel, so they would have to try this from scratch. And Veolia sold the stocks for a fraction of their value, and the Israeli companies are now struggling with the technology and the tramway, which was supposed to be finished by 2008, is still far from being finished, far from operating. It was already involved in 3 car accidents, however, because they don't really know how to operate it. So just the testing period is already bashing cars around, and this is really something that every Jerusalemite that walks to the street in the morning and sees the destruction in the street and the unused tram lines is reminded of boycott every day. So we should find more ample targets like this one.
Keith at the back.
Yeah,
We're taking in turns.
if I understood you correctly, you were talking about the Zionist regime and you said they realised they were fighting a losing battle. In which case, do you think they have a long-term strategy or not?
There was a poll 2 years ago in which 52% of the Israeli population said they don't believe Israel is going to exist in 50 years. And there was another poll that most young Israelis under the age of 20, would rather live somewhere else, would rather leave the country and move somewhere. This is really a sense of time is running out. And if you ask individual Israelis whether they have a strategy, some of them might have something. Some of them might say, yeah, we could kill all the Arabs, we can deport all the Arabs, we can laugh at the face of international community, we can launch a new Hasbara campaign, you know, an explanation, a propaganda, and the whole world will see things our way. But if you look at whether this can be translated into a policy that is adopted by the government or by any meaningful institution, the answer is no. They don't have a strategy. They cannot agree on a strategy. And I think this is one of the reasons that now is the time to act. We can change things at this point.
In the peace process, the naughty boy. And then you've had Netanyahu go to Poland, give a talk at a conference and say, we hope when Poland takes the presidency of the EU, Israel's standing in the EU will be improved.
Yeah.
Would you care to speculate as to what that might involve or what they hope to get from the EU?
Well, the East European countries, Czech Republic, Poland, are very strong supporters and allies of Israel because they buy Israeli weaponry and because they are also very strong allies of the US, and that also helps them. But I don't think we've seen very different policies coming from the EU when the chair country of the EU was Sweden, which is relatively more critical of Israel, as opposed to, for example, Czech Republic, which is completely supporting of Israel. The difference in practical terms was not so large. So I don't think this is the main issue here. The main issue is the growing gap between the government's policies and the civil society and grassroots organizations. That's where you see the gap expanding, and you see so much of a disparity between how governments have been completely useless in putting criticism against Israel, for example, after the attack on Gaza, or of the flotilla event, and on the other hand, you see the mass demonstrations and protests coming from the streets, and we really should find a way to get this protest also to the government level. But of course, the government will come in last. When the governments will join the struggle, and like they did eventually in South Africa, and join the boycott campaign and decide it as a policy, then that would be the final stage of the conflict.
Okay, there's plenty of. We've got plenty of time. I'm proposing that we finish the meeting about 10 to quarter to.
I just
to allow people to be able to buy the books.
Let me also say that I put my email there on the screen, so you're very welcome, all of you, to send me any question you didn't have time to ask, or if you need any materials. So please send me emails. That'd be very.
Tony next.
Okay, go. Right, coming back to Israeli export commodities. You mentioned about blood diamonds. Well, the latest figures that me and some friends have researched says that just 2008.
For the what? Sorry, could you say that again?
Israeli blood diamonds.
Yeah.
The latest, well, figures full stop for any Israeli exports is 2008. To do with the WTO and things like that. The report back to them, apparently. But the figure I've got here is that Israeli diamonds, it comes in at about 9.7 billion in 2008, and the next nearest commodity is Israeli electronics, which comes in at 7 billion. So I'm not quite sure which you think is the first.
It's to do with. Go on, you can say.
That is taking out rough diamonds. That is taking. I mean, I've got quite a lot of figures here, but there's something like 19.4 billion minus the rough exports of 4.2 billion, which gives 15.2 billion. Then off that, you've got to take about the fact that the world returns about 4.3 billion worth of diamonds that aren't good enough back to Israel.
Yeah.
So it comes up with 9.7 billion in 2008.
Yes. Well,
which in 2008 was the biggest export commodity of Israel.
Well, it really depends on how you define it. Yes, I agree. If you want to, the way that the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics divides into sectors, then yes, diamonds, at least in 2008, was the biggest export. I agree. But one of the problems that different forms of exports often get confused with each other. For example, some exports would be defined as electronics when they are in fact military exports. And then if you would add them to military export, you'd get different figures. The Israeli Ministry of Defense, for example, has its own export branch, which is not included in the statistics. They do their own independent exports at approximately $5 billion a year, which is, and they have their separate customs system. That's something, a bit of an aberration there.
So it's very complicated,
yeah, but I think the most important aspect of BDS is, like I said before, it's not to bring the Israeli economy to its knees and to make Israelis poor.
No.
It is to raise awareness and to educate people. So definitely the Diamond campaign is important and valid, and don't get me wrong, I don't oppose it. I think it's very important to get Israel out of the Kimberley process.
Yeah.
Definitely so. But sometimes we see a great success from things that their economic impact might not be as large. For example, a lot of singers that cancel their shows in Israel. So that's not going to affect the Israeli economy much, but it is affecting Israeli perception of reality very much. So what I'm saying is, I'm not here to tell you which campaign to choose. You can choose whatever you think is useful, and I will try to help with information and from Israel. This journey for them in a very difficult a path which will probably not end in democracy, because rarely do military revolutions end up in democracy. But there are also a lot of Palestinians, there are in fact a majority of Palestinians, who are still hopeful to see international support. And this support can be expressed either through the BDS or through purchasing Palestinian products or through taking protest and action. And this gives Palestinians the hope and the encouragement that if they take the non-violent path and demand rights from Israel, then they will not just be mowed down by Israeli machine guns, but they do have a chance of achieving justice this way. And of course, as an Israeli citizen and as a Jew, I much prefer the non-violence struggle, and I'm much more hopeful about the kind of reality that we can achieve in the aftermath of such a struggle. And I think it is in the interest of everyone living in Palestine, not just the Palestinians. So again, thank you very much, and I do apologize for not answering you.